Ladies and gentlemen, today is another special day, and we're going to be having a special person for our program. And before I do invite our guest, I would like to read her bio, and then from there, I'll have her onto the show. Then we can have our discussion. Stay tuned.
Dr. Taisha Dupree Wilson is a tenure track assistant professor of history at Coppin State University in Baltimore, Maryland. She is a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and a proud graduate of Masterman High School. After graduating high school, Dr. Wilson entered Howard University in Washington, D.C., where she earned her BA in history. She went on to obtain her law degree from Northwestern California University School of Law. Her law school trial and appellate advocacy thesis, entitled The Conscience of the Community: Race, Gender, and Jury Nullification in the Criminal Justice System. It examined the history of racism against African Americans in convictions and sentencing in the courts. During her time in the legal field, she worked for two private law firms before accepting an appointment with the U.S. Department of Justice and later the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Although Dr. Wilson spent many years in the field of law, she recognized that her professional calling was tied to her never ending passion for African American history. This led her to pursue a career in history through museums and academia. She went on to earn her master's and PhD in history from Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Her doctoral work highlighted the impact and influence of Philadelphia's Black radio stations and disc jockeys during the era of the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. Wilson's current research focuses on the role of African American media in covering and encouraging civil rights activism and the impact of Black lawyers during the era of Jim Crow. Dr. Wilson is the recipient of a number of awards, including the Alberta T. Green Scholastic Achievement Award and a Diversity Fellowship with the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. She also served as the Education and Program Coordinator for the Lillie Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum in Baltimore and previously served as professor in the Department of History at Bowie State University. She is a proud member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Phi Delta Phi International Law Fraternity, Phi Alpha Theta National History Honor Society, the National Council of Negro Women, and Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Dr. Wilson was dedicated and baptized at the 10th Memorial Baptist Church. She is married to Mr. Jermaine Wilson, an investigator for the federal government. The Wilsons reside in Maryland and are members of Kingdom Fellowship AME Church in Silver Spring, and they are the proud parents of Kenji and Kumasi.
Hello, viewers. Once again, this is Mosatus Media, and we are in a very exciting mood because Black History Month. We are already in another season of Black History Month, and then today we have a very special guest. She is not a guest, but I would say she's a member, or she always come onto this show to help us understand some of the movements that took place before our time. Today, we are going to be looking at the African American and Transatlantic Alliance in the 20th century. We believe that during slavery and in the Revolutionary War, there were so many movements that were geared in by bringing our civil rights and liberation to mankind in the American continent, United States, that I mean. But this very special person is a doctor and a historian in one of the leading universities in the United States. Please, let's welcome our big sister, Dr. Wilson. Doctor,
Hello, hello, hello. How are you?
I am doing well, and how are you?
I am good and happy to be here back with you again. It's always this time of year is always exciting for us as historians. We get to hone in on specific elements of African American history. So that's always something that's exciting for me. So
Yeah, yeah. I understand the theme for this year's or this season's Black History Month is about the arts.
mhm.
But with you, as a seasoned historian, I want us to tackle it from the African American and the Transatlantic Alliance in the 20th century. What do we mean by this big jargon or big phrase?
Well, that's a great question. So for me, I've always been fascinated by the alliances that African Americans drew with other Africans and people throughout the diaspora, but specifically those in Europe who lent an ear to the struggle and plight of African Americans in the United States. Um, During the time of Jim Crow, which was our system of segregation laws here in the United States, a lot of African Americans drew inspiration and allies from people overseas who were more interested in hearing about this message. Unfortunately, a lot of entities here in the United States were not receptive to even hearing about the message that of the struggle that was going on here in the country. But they did find a listening ear across the water. And a lot of African Americans tapped into that listening ear and used it to buoy the movement that was really bubbling underneath the surface here in
Oh,
the
okay.
United States.
Wow. We found countries like you said some few countries. Can you give me two or three examples of those countries? That
Sure, absolutely. Well, first off, France was a very, very comfortable
France.
landing spot for African Americans in the early part of the 20th century. But also, I would definitely say the UK as well.
United Kingdom.
Yes.
Wow. I'm surprised. They are also whites. But how come they were able to, I mean, give the African Americans audience?
Well, I would definitely say that the audience for African Americans have its origins really in the 19th century. So we're talking about pre 20th century, pre Harlem Renaissance.
Mhm.
We're going to see African American abolitionists even prior to the emancipation
Right.
of African Americans out of slavery going across the water to get allies for the movement in the international community. Of course, one such example is Frederick Douglass.
Okay.
We're going to see him
Right.
galvanize other free Black men and women and have them go across the pond, as we like to say, to Great Britain,
Okay.
to really, really try to, if you will, embarrass the United States on an international stage to talk about the way the United States is treating its African American population.
Okay.
And of course, you mentioned it being a majority white country in Great Britain. That is true. But guess what? The Brits can't get over 1776. They can't get over the disdain that they had
You mean
for America. So
you mean the Revolution War? The Revolution.
absolutely. They could not get over that Revolutionary War or the
Right.
War of 1812.
Mhm.
So you're going to see the Brits be receptive to hearing about the terrible ways in which African Americans are being treated in the United States.
Right.
So I will not say that the Brits' interest necessarily was rooted in altruism. It
Mhm.
was also rooted in political disdain for the United States. So there's that part.
Okay. So we can conclude that the British um, gave the African American audience all because of politics.
Yes, yes.
It isn't because they liked us. It's all because of politics.
Right. It was political. And a lot of people, they
Yeah.
say the enemy of my, what is it? The
Enemy of
enemy of
my
my
enemy
enemy is my
is my friend.
friend. So if it means that I can embarrass my so-called enemy, because remember, this is pre being, an ally with the United States, and I'm still upset about the Revolutionary War. I can embarrass the United States, which is now the world power on a international stage, which is why the Brits were all ears, the French, a lot of folks,
Right.
and again, it was more palatable of a situation for a lot of African Americans to talk about the struggles. Because remember, retribution is a real thing. So if I give a speech down in South Carolina about how terrible slavery is,
Right.
I can expect to endure racial terrorism after that speech is over from
Okay.
white supremacists.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
I will say Frederick Douglass did a very good job. He educated himself, and some of their efforts today, we are free. We can talk about the past at
Hmm.
ease. I understand you have a brochure for us,
Hmm.
and you want to take us through the African American and the Transatlantic alliances, the people, the kind of connections, the countries. Can
Hmm.
you just help us with that? Yeah.
Sure. So we talked about Douglas and we talked about blacks using, international audiences to gain
Mhm.
support for the movement to end really a system of oppression in this country. But Douglas was not the only one.
Okay.
There were a number of African American abolitionists that went across the water to gain support from the British community.
Okay.
Another example outside of Douglas would be William and Ellen Craft,
Okay.
who are pictured here. Now, the Crafts are an escaped slave couple. They were enslaved in Georgia. As you can tell, Miss Craft is very fair skinned, and that is because her father, her biological father, was her enslaver.
Okay.
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 She escaped slavery with her husband, who was a dark skinned man, drawn here, by pretending to be a white man and pretending that her husband was her slave.
Oh,
So
really?
that's how they were able to.
Very crafty.
Right. Hence their, I mean, look, you do what you got to do.
Yeah.
So he cut his wife's hair down to make her look like a man, put, a little hat on her, put her arm in a sling. Because remember, she's a slave. She doesn't know how to read or write.
Right.
So when they tried to get her to sign things on the train, she would say, "Oh, my arm's broken." So they really, really disguised themselves and they made it all the
Okay.
way to Philadelphia,
Okay.
and that is where they became free. And after that, they
Mhm.
decided to go on speaking tours to talk about the terrible conditions that African American slaves endured,
Okay.
which includes brutality, sexual assault, unfortunately, which she is a product of. Her mother was sexually violated by her owner father,
Right.
and she is the product of that rape. And also, of course, poor living conditions and trauma.
Okay. Wow. The crap. That's a family crap.
Yes, the
Okay.
craft. And
The crap.
actually, there is a wonderful exhibit in Baltimore at the B&O Railroad Museum
Yeah.
that highlights their escape from slavery. It is so fascinating.
Wow.
The way that they were able to make it from Georgia to
Wow.
Philadelphia, that was
In,
amazing.
in a form of a disguise. Wow. That was
Yes,
very, very crafty. You know.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
And they ultimately moved to England because their whole thing was we want to escape
Mhm.
before we start having kids. They did not want their children born into slavery. So that was really the thing that prompted them to leave. But they ultimately went over to England to gain support for the movement through their talks.
Wow. I mean, this is very interesting. They
Hmm.
moved to England.
Yes,
Talking
they
about the
did move back
19th
later.
century. How easy was it to move to England those days? I know they didn't have planes. They had to go by boat. How
Right.
easy was it?
It was
Immigration.
it was not easy, but it was something again that was welcomed because we want to hear all about the terrible things that America is doing to its Negro population. So come on over here.
Wow.
So a lot of speakers and people, of course, Henry Box Brown was another African American escaped slave who mailed himself in a box
Mhm.
from Virginia to Philadelphia,
Right.
and made it there safely. And he also went on a speaking tour in England as well.
Okay. So
Mhm.
let me get this. If you manage to travel from the South down to Philadelphia,
Mhm.
then partially you're a free person. You can always join the boat and go to whatever country you want to go to.
Well, back then, Philadelphia was like the promised land because there
Okay.
was a large free black population there. Canada was better because after they passed the fugitive slave laws, African Americans were always on edge if they escaped because your master could come into Philadelphia and retrieve you and take you back to where you were enslaved.
Wow.
So after that law passed, you're going to start to see people saying, I can't even settle for Philadelphia. I need to get to Canada or I need to get to England. And that is what people started to do with the help of the abolitionists who used their resources and money to help people escape.
Wow. Oh, see, let's see who's the next person. Ida B. Wills Barnett.
Yes,
What is
Ida B.
about her?
Wells Barnett,
Yes.
legendary leader in the late part of the 19th century, African American woman. She was born into slavery, but emancipation came when she was about maybe 3 or 4 years old, I believe.
Okay.
But she was educated, and she ultimately became a school teacher, a journalist. So she was a middle class woman. She was a woman of means. One of the things that she was known for was her anti lynching stance. A lot of her friends and a lot of black men in particular were being lynched in the South during
Okay.
this time. So she wrote about it in her newspaper called the Memphis Free Speech. And for that reason, they targeted her and burned down her newspaper. But she took her fight across the water
Okay.
to the British and talked about all the terrible things that people were doing to African American men. Lynching, especially when it was voting time. That's typically when the lynchings were up. Um, the number of lynchings went up around the time in which it was time to go vote. They wanted to deter black men from going out and voting.
Yeah. Cool. Before we move to the next stroll, you talked
Mhm,
about lynching.
mhm,
So most of us in the United States, yeah, we know what lynching is.
mhm,
But those outside the United States,
mhm,
I know we have viewers outside the United States and Africa. If they say lynching,
mhm.
what is lynching? And what is Jim Crow?
Sure.
I want us to put the two together.
So lynching is a practice of basically putting quote unquote justice on someone who you feel has done something wrong through mob action, which means two or three or four of us will go out, get the individual that we feel has done something inappropriate,
Right.
and we will kill him. There doesn't necessarily need to be a hanging
Mm-hmm.
for a lynching, although that was the most common form of lynching, lynching by hanging. But it's really the result of mob action where you are killing the individual that you feel has done something wrong.
Okay.
In the South, typically most black men were lynched behind allegations of an inappropriate touching or interaction with a white woman. Okay.
Okay.
Black women were also lynched as well if they were considered too sassy. She talks back, she's too sassy, or she's
Okay.
stealing. Children were also lynched as well, but typically they would lynch children in order to terrorize the parents.
Oh God, that was
Yeah.
so cruel.
Hmm.
Oh, that was so cool, man. Our cousins and uncles and grandfathers really went through a certain dispensation,
Absolutely.
horrified dispensation that we can't forget. These things needs to be
Absolutely.
taught.
Yes,
Yeah.
and you mentioned Jim Crow. Jim
Yes, Jim
Crow
Crow.
is the legal segregation system that existed in this country. There's always gonna be segregation during this time, of course, but it was legalized by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson
Right.
decision, which basically said that racial segregation is totally fine as long as the conditions are separate but equal. Well, we all know that those conditions were never equal.
Yeah.
And that law would not be overturned until 1954 with the court case Brown versus Board of Education.
Right.
Mhm.
Doctor, I mean, I'm just feeling some chills around my body. I'm discussing this lynching, and let's move to the next
Sure.
row. Yes.
So, foreign status for Black Americans. One of the things that allowed Ida B. Wells and others to occupy unique roles that were largely unavailable were because people had more of a understanding of African Americans or Black Americans when they went overseas. I had more space to say what I want to say when I'm across the water. And that's why that transatlantic alliance was so valuable to them. As a Black visitor, I'm able to talk about discrimination and anti lynching in the anti lynching movement. I could not do that in Virginia. I could not do that in Tennessee
Okay.
without some level of retribution, which typically came in the form of violence. Okay.
Right.
So the grievances that are going to be expressed overseas to European audiences are really going to be powerful because we're not fearing retaliation on a daily basis.
Okay. Wow. I see. Should we move to the next slide?
Mhm.
Yeah. This is Mr. Du Bois.
Yes.
W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay.
Yes. So W.E.B. Du Bois was an interesting figure for a lot of reasons. Of course, we know, he was Harvard educated, but he also believed in those transatlantic alliances. He, along with some of the other major writing figures of the time, the Elaine Locks, Richard Wrights, they were activists, but they also spent a lot of time in Europe.
Okay.
And, like a lot of African Americans during this time, Europe allowed them to have a stage to talk about the oppression of Black communities. And a lot of European travel was, you know, engaged in at that time because of the level of activism that I could engage in overseas that I can't do here in the United States. But one of
Okay.
the things that was very important to Du Bois was the notion of Pan Africanism. And just to give a definition for our audience, Pan African, Pan means all,
Oh,
which
yes.
means that regardless of where you are Black on the planet, whether
Right.
you're Black in Australia, Black in France, Black in Africa, Black in the UK, we are all the same people because we are all descended from Africa. So we have some level of solidarity and a shared experience that we can draw from as Black people, regardless of where we are on the planet.
Yeah.
So when he traveled internationally to, Europe, he was able to engage in those bonds of building Pan-African relationships with a lot of people. And he spent a lot of time in Ghana. He ultimately moved to Ghana when he became an expat. He left the United States because, like a lot of Black people at that time, they had had enough of Jim Crow and all the other things that come with being Black in America at the time.
Wow. Okay. I was told in Ghana he helped to find this malaria drug or something. I read something about that, but and then he passed away in Ghana, and his remains are still in Ghana. That's
Yes,
what I
he's
hear.
buried there. Yes.
Boys. And then we have a whole museum set up for the boys. It's called a Du Bois Center.
Hmm.
When you go to is it East Legon? No, when you go to the Rich area. All
Yes.
right, but tell me about Du Bois. Du Bois, going through, I realized that Du Bois traveled to Germany. That was his first time traveling outside the country.
Yes.
Okay.
So Du Bois was fascinated with Germany. He spent a lot of time in Berlin, and he also forged a very important friendship with Franz Boas, who was a German anthropologist.
Okay.
And also he was an advocate of anti-racist education because he believed that it was detrimental to humanity for people to be at odds based on race. So, of
Right.
course, this is music to the ears of Du Bois and everyone else who was fighting for racial equality.
Okay.
But Du Bois later invited Boas to come deliver the commencement address at Atlanta University, where Du Bois was a professor.
Okay.
So one of the things that Du Bois really gained from his alliance with the Germans that resonated with that whole message of anti-racism was the fact that there are white folks in the world that believe that what the United States is doing to its Negro or African American population
Right.
is wrong. And to have a white man come to Atlanta University and say that at graduation was a really big deal.
Wow. Wow.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. Let's look at the Robinsons.
Hmm.
Tell me about the Robinsons.
So Paul and Eslanda
Looks
were,
like they are couples, right?
yes, they are a married couple.
Yeah.
A lot of people, including myself, consider them to really be a civil rights power couple because they did a lot for the struggle and a lot for the movement. They were both activists in their own separate rights, but they were also collectively activists fighting against oppression in this country. But Paul Robeson had so many talents. He was a singer, he was a dancer, he was a stage performer, he was a football player, he was an attorney, and he was a civil rights activist.
Attorney.
So that's a lot, right?
Those days, an attorney. Wow.
Yes. So Eslanda, his wife, was his business manager. Very brilliant woman, a very smart woman, and someone who was invested not only in her husband's career, but also invested in helping to secure civil rights for Black people in this country. Now, whenever you're doing that, you know that you're going to attract the attention of the United States government.
Right.
So both of these individuals, Paul and Eslanda, had FBI files opened up on them because of their civil rights involvement. But that did not stop them from pursuing their transatlantic collaborations, which also drew the attention of the federal government because they were talking about ending Jim Crow and segregation at a time when that would get you a lot of government attention.
Wow. Okay.
So Eslanda became an ally and an advocate for oppressed and disenfranchised people. Her
Okay.
thing was, we need to get people voting ASAP. We need to get people registered to vote. And she used a lot of her contacts in Europe to help her on this plight. She left the US for London in 1928 and started to really, really take the African American message and political, I guess, prowess to the masses on an international stage.
Okay.
And one of the things that is just so amazing about her is that she was also a Pan Africanist. And being, of course, international travel, and I always tell my students is it changes you, it
Yeah.
changes your perception of the world.
Right.
And on her journeys to various places, to Africa, to Europe, she started to develop an even stronger Pan African ideology about herself. And through her travels and writings, she also emphasized the importance of securing international allies in the fight. So take your fight to the international stage because it will strengthen the movement. That was what she believed.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow. Yeah, that's the theme for today's show. I mean,
Hmm.
transatlantic alliances in the 20th century. All right.
Absolutely.
So the next person is Paul, right? Paul Robinson. Or we've spoken about Paul.
Yeah, so Paul was the husband, the star, right?
Okay.
So as I said before, he had a lot of major talents, but he was also a black nationalist who believed in empowering the black community. And he and his wife traveled throughout Europe. They also went to Africa, and he drew inspiration from the Communist Party. During this time, the Communist Party was very sympathetic to the plight of Black Americans and believed that Jim Crow and racism in this country should end. So, he did go to visit Eastern Europe in 1934.
Mhm.
He was almost attacked by Nazis in Germany. But also, when he visited Russia, he got a lot of support and a lot of respect from the Russians who believed that Jim Crow should end.
Right.
Now, he believed that the Russians did not harbor any racial animosity towards
Hmm.
blacks because they showed him so much respect and talked about how African Americans should have equal rights. And of
Right.
course, when he went to Russia, what happens to him? Uh, the FBI file gets
Hmm.
beefed up even more. And then J. Edgar Hoover is going to take his passport in 1950. He will not get it back until 1958.
Oh my God. Doctor, I'm going to ask a question.
Hmm.
This one is out of the line. Did the Russians ever participate in slavery? We don't hear about the Russians when we're talking about slavery. We don't really hear about them. Did they ever participate in slavery?
Right. Well, no, the Russians were not really major slave traders.
Okay.
When you're talking about major slave traders, you're talking about the Spanish,
Hmm.
the Portuguese,
Portuguese,
the
the
French,
Danish, the
the
French.
British,
Yeah.
the Dutch.
Mhm.
Those are the big five. Now, other nations tried to have their foot in the door in terms of. Now, I'm not going to say Russia has not benefited from the enslavement of Africans because, quite frankly, the entire world benefited from because the proceeds from the enslavement of Africans during those 300 years funded the Industrial Revolution. So everybody benefited from the Industrial Revolution. So indirectly, we can make the argument that Russia did, in fact, benefit.
Benefited indirectly.
Right. But they were not one of the major slave traders like, the French, the Dutch,
Yeah,
the Portuguese. The Spanish and Portuguese had a monopoly on the slave trade at one point. But as time goes on, you're going to see the French and the British get heavy into the game as well.
right.
Hmm.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, let's look at our Marines.
Hmm.
They were in Paris.
Yes.
Tell me about the military. Black folks in the military.
Yes.
How
So
easy was it?
it was, well, it wasn't easy, but for African American men, this is just what was. Now, just so you know, African American men have fought in every war that we've ever had, okay?
Okay.
Including the wars that existed prior to us being the United States, which of course includes the American Revolution. Blacks fought in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, obviously the Civil War,
Right.
the Spanish American War. So not much is going to be different when we get to World War One. You're going to see African American men signing up to fight in the war because their whole feeling was, if I go over and show them that I am ready to die for my country, surely when I come back home after doing that, that they will allow me to vote. They will allow me to walk through the front door of an establishment if I want to get a bite to eat.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that did not happen. But over 200,000 African American men fought over in France during World War One, and 90% of the soldiers, of course, were from the American South. So this
Right.
feeling of hope of, if I just show them my patriotism, maybe they'll let me vote, really was a catalyst for Black men wanting to serve in the military during World War One. But unfortunately, when they came back home, they did not enjoy what they thought they would enjoy, and that's just being treated like a regular citizen.
No respect. That was
Mhm.
so sad. And because of that, most of them relocated. They refused to even come back based on information that were being received from home. That some of the soldiers were not treated with respect. So those after the war, some decided even not to come back.
Right,
And
because
yeah,
there was more, as I always tell my students, there was more freedom in France. Now, again, I am not making the argument that there was no racism in France. We know that is not true. There
mhm,
was French racism, and in fact, during this time, you had France colonizing parts of Africa.
yeah,
So we're not saying that there was no racism in France, but what
but
we're saying is that it was a different brand of
of
racism.
racism, no Jim Crow, no lynching.
No, no Jim Crow. Jim Crow did not exist. You could go into an establishment and sit down and be called monsieur, so they
Yeah,
would respect you in that way. But at the same time, there was this thing that they call negrophilia,
yeah,
which was, it's still racist, but it's more of a fascination with Black people. Like, wow, look at his hair, look at his skin. Wow, listen to that jazz music he's playing and looking and trying to touch your hair. So that's still racist, but it's not that Jim Crow
yeah,
brand of racism. And during the Harlem Renaissance, you are going to see a lot of Black Americans going over to France, those who could afford it,
right.
to enjoy that freedom that they could not enjoy in the United States. And one of the catalysts for the French falling in love with Black people, I'm sorry, not Black people, let me say Black culture. Because there
Okay.
are a lot of people that love Black culture, but they don't necessarily love
Like
Black
the black
people.
people.
Yeah, so that jazz music, the
Yeah,
French absolutely fell in love with African American music, which was
yeah.
jazz at the time.
The
Um,
blues. Yeah,
oh my God, they loved it. So you're gonna have Maman, you're gonna have all these different places,
yeah.
all these brick top restaurants and things like that in France, really starting to play jazz. They were even playing jazz on the radio in
Wow.
France until Hitler stopped them, but that was later
Oh,
during World War II when he said no more Black music on the radio.
right. Was it easy for a black person to compose a song on the radio? In Ghana, sorry, in the United States, a
Sure.
black person will have to adopt a white person's name to be able for his name to be on a record label those days. But in France, was it that easy?
Oh, music was always easy. Even in
Mhm,
the United States, you may not own your record or your masters or your royalties,
mhm.
but they'll let you make a record. And in fact, they'll listen to it, they'll love it on the radio, but they don't necessarily want you in their space. So I don't necessarily like the musician,
Right.
but I like the music. And that even happens today. You have a lot of people that love their favorite sports player is a black man,
yeah,
their favorite singer is a black woman, but at the same
mhm,
time, they don't necessarily want to have a lot of dealings with black people. And there was no difference back then. You
yeah,
know, people love the culture, they love the music,
mhm,
but it was difficult even in France. But France was just more comfortable because you
yeah,
can feel something like a person when you
yes,
were there. And
yes.
that was something that, a lot of people loved.
Yeah, and Sharita were in France. I think March, right? When was that? November. We were in France, and it was like, wow. I mean, we were treated with some respect, and we just love going through all those monuments and Black History monuments. And then that was when I got to know about who Napoleon Bonaparte it was,
Yes.
and then what's the name? The guy who wrote the Count of Monte Cristo, and
Hmm.
several. All right, let's look at this beautiful lady,
Hmm.
Josephine Becker. What do you know about her? Tell me about
So Josephine Baker was another African American who developed a lot of transatlantic alliances, but she felt more in her skin when she was in France.
her.
As we all know, she was a dancer, a singer, an actor. She was everything.
Mhm.
She was so talented, and her talent could not be relegated to what they wanted her to do in Hollywood. They wanted her to play maids in
Oh no.
Hollywood. And her whole thing was, I have three maids. Why am I playing a maid?
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? And also, it's just so much. How can someone this with this level of talent be relegated to small roles? Cleaning houses and movies. So for that reason, she is going to have her house in the United States, but she's also going to have a chateau in France.
Yeah.
So whenever the Americans would get on her nerves, she would go over to her chateau in France. In the 1920s, when she officially moved to France, she soon became one of Europe's most popular and highest paid performers, black or white.
Wow.
And her costumes were legendary. We all know about the banana skirt that she made iconic. And really, her whole image was a symbol of the jazz age, which is, of course, during the Harlem Renaissance and shortly thereafter.
Wow.
But Josephine Baker was
Mhm.
not just a beautiful person that was a performer,
Mhm.
she was also a civil rights activist.
Okay.
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 So during World War II, she was also a spy. She
As,
served as
as
a
a
spy,
spy.
yes,
Oh my
for the
God.
French resistance.
Tell me
And she
about
would
it.
transport secrets across the border on the back of her sheet music in invisible ink.
Oh my God.
And she was recognized by the French for her service to the military. But she also was a mother. She adopted 12 children from around the world, different races, and
Wow.
raised them together and called them her rainbow tribe because she wanted to prove to people that you're not born racist, you're taught to hate. So if she's raising kids, she has a kid from Africa, a kid from Japan, a kid from Venezuela, and they're all loving each other and coming up together as brothers and sisters.
Wow.
That's evidence that
That, that, that
racism
was in
is
the
wrong.
1920s.
Yes,
By
absolutely
then, by then we haven't even gone through the civil rights march. Martin Luther
right.
hasn't given the so how did Americans see her? How did they treat her after having those 12
Well, she
children
was ahead
from
of
different?
her time. I always say that Josephine Baker was ahead of her time. On the one hand, Americans really respected her and loved her. But at the same time, I'm sorry, Black Americans respected her and loved her.
Yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, a lot of people saw her as a troublemaker in certain situations
Yeah.
because she demanded respect. And that is why she did not gel well with Hollywood because there's
Okay.
a certain role she would not play.
Right.
But a lot of people see her as an icon, and she's inspired so many Black female performers, even after, her era of being a performer. And she showed up at the March on Washington in 1963 wearing a
Wow.
French military uniform.
French military uniform.
So she was a troublemaker even in the 1960s. But we need people like this,
Yeah.
to force people to treat people equally. You
Right.
know?
Sharita just reminded me of when we were in France, we visited her burial site,
Mhm,
and she's buried exactly where the record of
mhm,
Mary Magdalene, Madame Magdalene, is preserved in a certain Catholic church.
Hmm.
And it was something else. It was something else. I mean, the tour guide took us through, and she spoke highly how beautiful she was, but she was a character of a different class.
Right. Yeah, and she was a no nonsense lady.
Yes.
People were afraid to cross her, and that's how you have to be back then. Especially when you're that talented and you're trying to keep someone in a box. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see who's next on the list. Oh, still
Mm-hmm.
her. Okay. Our friend James Baldwin. Tell me about James Baldwin.
So James Baldwin was another
Yes.
artist who found refuge overseas in Paris. And again, he's first going to experience living abroad around 1948. He's going to relocate there because, again, the Jim Crow was a big deal. And I always tell people this during this time, of course, now we have racism here in this country.
Right.
But at this time, Jim Crow is in every area and arena of your life. Jim Crow is on the trains. Jim Crow is in the ocean. You can't
Mm,
swim in certain beaches. You can't shop at certain stores. You can't eat at certain lunch counters.
mm,
Even the cemetery was segregated. So they had a black part of the cemetery where they would bury the black people in a white part of the cemetery. So even after you die, you're still subjected to Jim Crow.
Jim Crow.
So James Baldwin came to Paris and fell in love with the city because he believed that, of course, there's racial discrimination again, but he believed that it was nothing like what he had experienced in the United States. And he viewed the French as allies in the fight against Jim Crow because a lot of French officials did, in fact, speak out against Jim Crow at that time. So when he went to Paris,
Yeah.
he of course was aware of all the issues with France and their colonization of Africa, which we are not underestimating.
Right.
But he still felt as though he could be more of who he was as a person in terms of an artist and as a black man in Paris. So he lived there off and on for 9 years.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow. I think let's look at the next slide.
Hmm.
Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yes.
The
So
politicians, the politicians do call him Martin Luther King, but the man is a reverend.
yes, he's a
they,
reverend
they,
and a
they don't want to,
doctor,
they don't want to
reverend
attach the
doctor.
reverend. They always call him Martin Luther King. But he's a reverend. He's a pastor.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, you know that we've pretty much recreated
yeah.
Dr. King.
Hmm.
And I always tell people that the king that we now celebrate is not the king that existed when he was alive. We've kind of made him this Disney version of himself
Right.
because he was a radical and a revolutionary, and he was
Oh,
not this beloved figure when he was alive,
wow.
not by mainstream America. Of course, the black community, most folks resonated with Dr. King, and even my grandparents had pictures of Dr. King hanging in their house and things like that.
Hmm.
Um, but in terms of mainstream America and the federal government,
Right.
they were not, fans of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But he also found transatlantic alliances in the 1960s
Right.
through his travels in Europe. Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, I hate to jump backwards to France again,
Yeah.
but I just want to make it very clear before I get into Dr. King
Hmm.
that during World War One, the United States would not decorate its soldiers, its own black soldiers. So France had to decorate the black soldiers,
What a
the
shame.
United States. So another country is decorating your soldiers. World War Two, the United States finally decorated its own black soldiers because, again, you shoot Nazis out of the sky in a plane. I
Right.
would think that you would want to decorate those men.
What? So it means that they were decorating the soldiers for
Yes,
political reasons, just to piss the U.S. off, I
yes,
guess.
yes. But the men were so happy to be recognized because even the French said, they saved us, they helped us.
Right.
So I just want to make that clear. But also, again, World War II, you're going to see the federal government finally decorate black men for their service. That we had the Tuskegee Airmen,
Yeah.
and all those guys fighting and fighter pilots
Yeah. The
shooting
blue
Nazis out of
tails.
the sky.
Yes. Yes. All
So
those
that's a good
guys.
thing.
Yeah.
So Dr. King, in his travels to the United Kingdom, he's going to make multiple trips there, talking about the movement that is really coming to fruition at that time in the United States, which was the modern phase of the civil rights movement.
Mhm.
A lot of Black Brits are going to express to Dr. King that they too were experiencing racism in the UK. Because remember, there is going to be an influx of immigrants coming out of the Caribbean
Okay.
to the UK at this time. And the response to that was white supremacy. Why are all these Black people coming over here stealing our jobs? That was
Yeah.
what the Brits were saying. There was a lot of violence against Black communities during that time.
Mhm.
You are going to see a British Black Panther Party emerge. And
Okay.
also, the Black British movement is going to look a lot like the civil rights movement here in the United States.
Okay.
They drew a lot of inspiration from Dr. King. And also with race relations being such a sensitive issue for the government in the 50s and 60s,
Right.
King might have been seen by the British establishment as a troublemaker, but
Right.
for most part he wasn't. So he didn't get the anger from the British government that he got from the United States government when
Right.
he went over there.
So we already had black folks
Mhm.
in the UK.
Yes.
They were looked down upon,
Hmm.
but the UK will extend a hand to the black folks in the United States.
Right. And that's why I say this is very political. And I always tell people be intellectually honest when you're studying these movements.
Yes.
Because all it may seem like, oh, the Brits, they were so wonderful, they were so amazing. They were amazing to Black Americans at times when Black Americans traveled over there.
Mm.
But the Black British population that was there at the time,
Yeah.
that we refer to in the history community as the Windrush generation, because that was the name of the ship that they came over on, looking for jobs and new opportunities. They
Okay.
were treated terribly
Wow.
by the British government and British some British citizens. Their Black businesses were attacked and burned. People were the police brutality was at an all time high during this time in the UK for
Mhm.
Black Brits. So I want to make that very clear.
So what was going through Martin Luther King and Du Bois, their mind when they went to the UK and they saw their own brothers and sisters were being suppressed, but they were rather giving audience?
They
Did they
called
see?
it
Did they
out.
see the hypocrisy?
Yes, and Dr. King called it out, and that's another thing that I don't like that we do with Dr. King. Oh, he was non-confrontational. Oh, he just no. Dr. King called stuff out, and that is something that we have lost, unfortunately, because we're always fearing retribution, being
Right.
canceled, and all this other stuff. But Dr. King called things out, and he did in fact call out the fact that Black Brits were being mistreated in the
Right.
United Kingdom. Yes.
All right. Let's move to the next person, Malcolm X. Now, on the books, Malcolm X and Dr. King, were they both violent?
Well,
On the
no.
books.
See, Dr. King and Malcolm, although their philosophies initially were very different
Yes.
because just their philosophy and their take on civil rights activism and the style may have been different, but
Mhm.
towards the end of their lives, they sounded more alike than we realized,
Okay.
right? Because remember, Malcolm X wanted to do civil rights activism, but at the
Mhm.
time he was a member of the Nation of Islam.
Right.
The Nation of Islam did not believe in getting politically involved at all, but also they did not want to be involved in the civil rights movement. That was a problem for Malcolm. So,
Okay.
although people tried to pit Dr. King and Malcolm against each other,
Mhm.
they both had the same end goal, which was Black liberation. And I always tell people there are many paths to freedom. You may be a Malcolm or a Martin. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter. As long as we're getting to our goal is to Black liberation, we can work together. But the problem is, as time goes on, your mindset changes on certain things. And that's what happened to Malcolm. His international travel transformed his ideology as it came to civil rights activism and race. And
Right.
he also believed in transatlantic collaborations. In fact, in 1964, okay, a year before he died
Mhm.
or was killed, spoke at Oxford University. And he talked about the importance of internationalizing the Black struggle in America, We can't just tell black people and white people in the United States that this is bad. We need to tell the world that this
Right.
is bad. And a lot of students were attracted to this message for the Alliance. And if you look in this photo,
Right.
the back row is all white.
He was the
Okay.
only black among them.
Yeah, there were maybe one or two. This is a cropped picture, but there were other black students there.
And this picture was taken in Europe or in the United States.
In Europe, this is taken at Oxford University. Yes, in Europe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So I say all that to say that remember, when he was a member of the Nation of Islam, he was a black separatist, which means no dealings at all with whites.
Mm-hmm.
He used to always say the only thing I like integrated is my coffee, and that means putting the milk in in the coffee. No black and white mixing. But
Right.
as time goes on, and he had positive experiences with white Muslims on his Hajj when he went to Mecca. In other situations, he opened up his mind more, and he even worked at one point with the SNCC, with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the South, to organize protesters before he died.
Oh, wow. Wow. Malcolm X a lot.
Mhm.
But we hardly talk. I think Martin Luther King has kind of shadowed Malcolm X for a whole generation. It looks like. I don't know whether it's the role of the media or what, but
Well,
I
yeah, that's
yes,
definitely
kind of
that's a
shadow.
they definitely played a role in that. Yes, but people who study Malcolm's speeches and Dr. King's speeches, especially towards the end of their lives, we realize how similar the two ideologies were as time goes on. So,
Right.
absolutely.
I know time is fast spent. We have two slides to talk about, and I can let you go, Doctor.
No,
I
no worries.
yes, the black soldiers in World War II. Did we cover that? I don't think so. Did we? We just talked about just a bit of it.
Yes, so let's talk about the black soldiers in World War II again. As I
Yes.
just mentioned, during World War One,
Hmm.
the United States government would not decorate African American soldiers.
Okay.
So the French decorated African American soldiers instead. World War II, we are finally going to see black soldiers from the United States being decorated by their own government.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Transatlantic alliances were really important too to the black soldiers as well as they fought in World War II. And a lot of them serving abroad were viewed the military service as a means of assessing all of the privileges that came with being an American citizen. Remember, we're still way before the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Wow.
So a lot of black men who attempted to go and vote were prevented from voting, even those that had served in the military, even those who were like this group of gentlemen here, the Tuskegee Airmen, who
Yes.
were fighter pilots during World War II, who were shooting Nazi planes out of the sky and killing Hitler's army.
Yeah.
They couldn't even vote when they got back home. Okay.
That was how
So,
bad the Jim Crow was. That was how bad
yeah.
it was.
Yes, absolutely. So African American soldiers, one of the things that happened to them during this time, after just getting a taste of what it felt like to be treated like a full citizen in France, when you
Yes.
can go to a restaurant and not be Jim Crowed, they said, "I want this on my in my land. I want this back in the United States."
Right.
So a lot of these folks, when they went back home, they became civil rights leaders. They became civil rights activists
Okay.
because you cannot experience a taste of freedom and be the same. You're always going to want it. You're always going to have a desire for it. So, for that reason, you're going to see African American soldiers relying on these transatlantic alliances, but
Mhm.
they're also taking this energy that they developed during the war back home. And that is going to help them on their quest for civil rights.
Wow. Oh, I see.
Hmm.
So who's next? Tina Turner.
Yes,
Tina Turner moved to
absolutely.
Europe.
Yes.
Wow.
So, a lot of people, I'm telling you, African American
Yeah. I think
expatriates,
it was Switzerland, right? Tina Turner. I think it
yeah.
was Switzerland. Yeah. She just relocated.
Yeah, so she, along with a lot of other folks, decided that they had had enough of the United States for various reasons.
Mhm.
Expatriates or expats, as we call them, this is a person residing in a country other than the native country that they come from.
Right.
So you're going to have a lot of Black Americans leaving the United States in search of freedom from segregation,
mm,
disrespect, and racial
mm,
violence. People were tired of being lynched. People were tired of being chased or relegated to certain, jobs that so a lot of people, artists, especially, are going to leave the country, including
mm,
James Baldwin, Richard Wright. We talked about Josephine Baker, opera singer Jesse Norman,
wow,
and of course, Miss Tina Turner. Each of them are going to migrate, to different places. You're also going to have other individuals like Eartha Kitt and other people leave the country
right,
because it was just difficult at this time for a lot of people in the artistic community to really come into fruition of who they were as artists without dealing with the racism and the prejudice and being, having their growth stunted by, discrimination.
right,
So a lot of them are going to go over and live in Europe. Of course, there is anti-Black rhetoric going on in Europe, and also this push against African migration to Europe. So Europe is not a perfect place.
right.
And I'm not trying to make that argument, but for some Black Americans, they felt as though Europe was a lot more comfortable than the United
Yeah,
States.
yeah.
Mhm.
Would you also like to relocate someday?
Um, on a tropical island somewhere, maybe. I don't know. If there's a beach involved, I'll think about it.
Maybe I'll recommend Ghana, because I know you've been to Kumasi.
Yes, I've been to Ghana.
Your son is called Kumasi.
Yes, my son is
I'll
named
recommend Ghana, maybe Cape
after.
Coast or Kumasi. Hmm.
Yes. So,
Yes.
I love traveling.
Yeah.
So it's always something that I take pride in traveling and gaining new experiences because
Yeah.
you can't live a life just living where you are, where you
Right.
were born. You have to
Yeah.
get out there and travel internationally. And a
Yeah.
lot of people in the presentation that we just did discovered that there was value in forming transatlantic alliances to
Right.
help buoy your struggle for equality. It just helped them.
So, doctor, so today we've talked about Transatlantic Alliance. So,
Mhm.
when you visited Ghana, what do you see? I want you to tell your students. And then, what did you
Mhm.
see when you visited Ghana? West Africa.
Yes.
Hmm.
So it just felt like for me, the first landing in Ghana, it just felt like familiar to me.
Okay.
It almost felt like I was going like when we were kids, we used to go down south to South Carolina to visit relatives
Right.
all the time, and it gave me that South Carolina feeling when I was in Ghana. I met a lot of good people, nice people, and I also met a lot of people who had no knowledge of Black American history,
Right.
and when I started to share some of the things that Black Americans had gone through, I was being told by some Ghanaians that they had never heard the details because it's not shared in Ghanaian schools. That say there's slavery, they were enslaved, taken to the Americas, and
Right.
that was it. They don't get into detail. So it was good having those conversations and exchanging history because it's
Right.
really enriching to do that.
Right. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you.
You've made 53 minutes, and I should say, God bless you. God give you back that energy that you've lost.
Thank you.
I was speaking with my pastor the other time, and your name came up, and he's so excited, wanting to have you to come to church maybe next year,
Oh,
February, to give us a briefing, a
mhm.
briefing on Black History Month. I
Absolutely.
want to
Count
say
count me in.
I want to say thank you so much. Whenever I call on you to come give us a lecture, you just come, you don't hesitate, you don't give excuses. And I say, our big sister is doing well, and we are praying the Lord should move you higher and
Thank you.
higher and higher and higher. Thank you so much. This is Mozatus Media. We are in the season of Black History Month, and our guest, our sister, is Dr. Wilson. And once again, she's come to give us a lecture.
Tenure track assistant professor of history at Coppin State University in Baltimore, Maryland. She is a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and a proud graduate of Masterman High School. After graduating high school, Dr. Wilson entered Howard University in Washington, D.C., where she earned her BA in history. She went on to obtain her law degree from Northwestern California University School of Law. Her law school trial and appellate advocacy thesis, entitled The Conscience of the Community: Race, Gender, and Jury Nullification in the Criminal Justice System. It examined the history of racism against African Americans in convictions and sentencing in the courts. During her time in the legal field, she worked for two private law firms before accepting an appointment with the U.S. Department of Justice and later the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Although Dr. Wilson spent many years in the field of law, she recognized that her professional calling was tied to her never ending passion for African American history. This led her to pursue a career in history through museums and academia. She went on to earn her master's and PhD in history from Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Her doctoral work highlighted the impact and influence of Philadelphia's black radio stations and disc jockeys during the era of the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. Wilson's current research focuses on the role of African American media in covering and encouraging civil rights activism and the impact of black lawyers during the era of Jim Crow. Dr. Wilson is the recipient of a number of awards, including the Alberta T. Green Scholastic Achievement Award and a Diversity Fellowship with the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. She also served as the Education and Program Coordinator for the Lillie Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum in Baltimore and previously served as professor in the Department of History at Bowie State University. She is a proud member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Phi Delta Phi International Law Fraternity, Phi Alpha Theta National History Honor Society, the National Council of Negro Women, and Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Dr. Wilson was dedicated and baptized at the 10th Memorial Baptist Church. She is married to Mr. Jermaine Wilson, an investigator for the federal government. The Wilsons reside in Maryland and are members of Kingdom Fellowship AME Church in Silver Spring, and they are the proud parents of Kenji and Kumasi.
I want to thank you all for spending your quality time with us. This program was streamed live from Pennsylvania, Colma, in the United States. My name is Martin Pettigol, and please stay tuned next week for another special guest. The song in the background is coming from a very good friend of mine called Master Drummer. He's in Belgium. He has given me this music to celebrate Black History Month. This song was written in a language, Ewe language from Africa. I love you all. See you soon.
Only the cabin will one eye. Cabin was a meadow, only the cabin one eye. Was a meadow, only the cabin will one eye. And then Yaglagara, Nalepo Jirachi, Menyashi Sala, she would not a tie. Was a meadow, only the cabin one eye. Was a meadow. Only the cabin will one eye.